The Forgotten Message. It was a stormy winter night in the quiet town of Ashford. Clara, a young nurse, had just finished her late shift at the local hospital. The rain was pouring heavily, and the wind howled through the barren trees. As she walked to her car, she noticed a frail, elderly woman standing alone under a flickering streetlight. Clara felt a pang of sympathy for the woman and decided to offer her a ride. The stranger introduced herself as Mrs. Johnson and climbed into the passenger seat with a thankful smile. She directed Clara to her address, a decrepit old house at the edge of town. The house was a dilapidated Victorian mansion, its windows boarded up and its gardens overgrown with weeds. Clara couldn't help but wonder how someone could live in such a place. Mrs. Johnson explained that she had inherited it from her parents, but had never been able to bring herself to leave it. Inside, the house was as eerie as its exterior. Dusty furniture covered in white sheets and faded family portraits lining the walls painted a picture of a lifelong past. Clara couldn't help but shiver, her unease growing as she glanced at the portrait of a young girl who seemed to be staring back at her with sorrowful eyes. Mrs. Johnson insisted on serving tea, and Clara accepted to be polite. As they sat in the dimly lit dining room, Mrs. Johnson's conversation grew increasingly cryptic. She spoke of her late husband and daughter, mentioning a tragic accident that had taken them away from her. Clara noticed that Mrs. Johnson often seemed to drift into moments of confusion, as though she was struggling to piece together the past. She was about to offer assistance when her host suddenly stopped talking and looked directly at her.
"Young lady, I have a message for you. It's from my daughter, Emily."
Clara was taken aback.
"Your daughter? But, Mrs. Johnson, I don't know your daughter. I've never met her."
A ghostly smile flickered across Mrs. Johnson's face, and she leaned in closer.
"That's what you think, my dear. Emily wants you to know the truth about this house, about the darkness that lingers here."
Clara was intrigued, but also growing increasingly uncomfortable. She wasn't sure what to make of Mrs. Johnson's cryptic message. Before she could respond, the lights in the room flickered, plunging them into darkness. Clara's heart raced as she fumbled for her phone to use its flashlight. When the room was bathed in an eerie glow once more, Clara's breath caught in her throat. Mrs. Johnson was gone, and the dining room was empty. Her teacup sat alone on the table, still warm to the touch. Panic set in as Clara rushed through the house, calling out for Mrs. Johnson. The old woman had vanished without a trace, leaving no sign of her presence except for that haunting feeling of sorrow that still hung in the air. Feeling a chill that had nothing to do with the drafty old house, Clara decided to leave. As she stepped out into the stormy night, she couldn't shake the sense that something wasn't right. She felt as though she had stumbled upon a dark secret, one that she couldn't ignore. Over the next few days, Clara couldn't stop thinking about her encounter with Mrs. Johnson. She decided to do some research, and what she discovered sent shivers down her spine. Emily Johnson, Mrs. Johnson's daughter, had disappeared under mysterious circumstances years ago. Clara couldn't help but feel a connection to this unknown woman. She couldn't explain why, but she felt as though Emily's message, whatever it might be, was meant for her. With a sense of trepidation, she returned to the old mansion, determined to uncover the truth. The house was as forbidding as ever, but Clara pressed on, exploring its dark and dusty corridors. As she climbed the creaking stairs to the second floor, she noticed a trail of fresh, wet footprints leading toward a room at the end of the hallway. Her heart pounded as she pushed open the door and entered a room filled with old toys, faded stuffed animals, and a small child-sized bed. It was Emily's room, preserved just as it had been when she vanished. Clara's flashlight beam fell on a small diary sitting on a dusty shelf. With trembling hands, she opened it, and the pages revealed a heartbreaking story. Emily had been a lonely child, often confined to her room by her overprotective mother. She had dreamed of escaping the house, exploring the world beyond its walls. Final entry in the diary sent a chill down Clara's spine. It was a desperate plea for help, written in shaky handwriting. Emily had discovered a hidden passage in the house, one that led to a secret room where she believed her mother was hiding something sinister. Determined to follow in Emily's footsteps, Clara searched for the hidden passage. She eventually discovered a concealed door behind a bookshelf, leading to a narrow, winding tunnel. The air grew colder and more oppressive as she descended into the darkness. At the end of the tunnel, Clara found herself in a small hidden chamber. It was filled with old newspaper clippings, photographs, and letters, all detailing a sinister truth. Mrs. Johnson had been involved in a series of unexplained deaths that dated back decades. She had been the common thread in each tragedy, and the evidence pointed to her involvement in the deaths of her husband, her daughter, and many others. Clara's heart raced as she realized the full extent of the horrors that had taken place within the walls of Blackwood Manor. It was a house tainted by darkness, a place where the past lingered like a haunting specter. As Clara left the chamber and made her way back through the winding tunnel, she couldn't help but feel that Emily's message had been a plea for justice. She had uncovered a truth that had been buried for far too long, a truth that would finally bring an end to the darkness that had plagued Blackwood Manor for generations. But as Clara emerged from the tunnel, she was met with a chilling sight. Mrs. Johnson stood before her, her eyes filled with malevolence, a wicked smile playing on her lips.
You were never meant to find this. You were never meant to uncover our secrets.
Before Clara could react, the walls of the tunnel closed in around her, trapping her in darkness. Her flashlight flickered and died, leaving her alone with the malevolent presence of Mrs. Johnson. Clara's screams echoed through the underground chamber, but there was no one to hear them. The secrets of Blackwood Manor remained hidden, its dark history preserved for eternity. And so, the house stood as a testament to the horrors of the past, a place where the boundaries between reality and nightmare blurred, and where the truth was a chilling message that could only be uncovered by those brave enough to face the darkness within.